Something is happening to the most conscious people in our society, and nobody's talking about it. The individuals who've touched the depths of their own being, who've glimpsed reality beyond the veil of everyday existence, are quietly stepping back from the world they once desperately tried to conquer. They're not making dramatic announcements or burning bridges, they're simply losing interest. The career ladder that once seemed so important now feels like a hamster wheel. The social gatherings that used to energize them now drain their very soul. The material possessions they worked so hard to acquire sight gathering dust, no longer sparking any joy or meaning. Carl Jung witnessed this pattern repeatedly throughout his decades of studying human consciousness. He discovered that spiritual awakening doesn't lead to greater engagement with the world as we know it. Instead, it creates what he called a necessary withdrawal, a psychological death that precedes a profound rebirth. Today, we're exploring Jung's warning about what happens when you truly wake up spiritually, why the most evolved souls among us are quietly letting go of everything they once held dear, and why this phenomenon isn't a retreat from life, but perhaps the most courageous step toward authentic existence. If you've been feeling that strange pull away from the world, that growing disinterest in things that used to matter, Jung would tell you this isn't depression or failure, it's evolution. And it's happening to awakening souls everywhere. Here's what Jung understood about spiritual awakening that most people miss entirely. Awakening isn't the beginning of a beautiful journey toward enlightenment. It's the beginning of a psychological death. The death of who you thought you were. When someone experiences genuine spiritual awakening, their entire relationship with reality undergoes a fundamental shift. The structures that gave their life meaning, their goals, careers, relationships, even their sense of time and future, all begin to collapse. Not because they're broken, but because they're suddenly seen through. Jung observed this pattern in patient after patient. A successful businessman would come to him after a profound spiritual experience, completely unable to care about his company anymore. A devoted mother would describe feeling disconnected from her role after touching something infinite within herself. These weren't cases of mental illness. They were cases of consciousness evolution. The awakened person finds themselves in what Jung called the liminal space between ego collapse and self-birth. It's like being suspended between two worlds. You can no longer live from your old identity, but you haven't yet fully embodied your new one. Everything feels hollow, meaningless, like you're walking through a world made of cardboard. This phase creates what appears to be a crisis of motivation. The ego, which previously drove all ambitions and desires, has been transcended or severely diminished during the awakening process. Former goals lose their appeal. External validations feel empty. The very things that used to get you out of bed in the morning now seem pointless. Jung recognized this as what he called enantiodromia, the phenomenon where something taken to its extreme transforms into its opposite. The person who was once driven by worldly success suddenly finds themselves unable to care about success at all. The individual who sought external validation now feels nauseated by praise. It's not laziness or depression. It's a profound spiritual reversal. Most people experience this and think something is wrong with them. They try to force themselves back into their old patterns, back into caring about things they no longer find meaningful. But Jung discovered this withdrawal isn't a problem to be solved. It's a necessary stage in psychological development. He called this phase the negredo, borrowing from alchemical terminology. It's the dark night of the soul where the old self dissolves before the new self can emerge. In alchemical terms, the base metal must be completely broken down before it can be transformed into gold. The person experiencing this feels like they're dying, and in a very real psychological sense they are. Our culture fears this silence and attempts to avoid it at all costs. We label it as dysfunction, as something that needs to be fixed immediately. We prescribe medications, suggest therapy, encourage people to snap out of it and get back to being productive. But Jung understood that this phase serves a sacred purpose. It's the psychological cocoon where transformation occurs. During this withdrawal, something profound is happening beneath the surface. The unconscious is rising, not as a villain but as a messenger. What was once repressed, the grief, the rage, the unmet needs, begins to surface because there's finally space for it. The constant doing, achieving, and performing that characterized the pre-awakening life gave no room for this deeper material to emerge. Jung experienced this personally during what he later called the most important period of his life. In 1913, at age 38, his world collapsed. After his break with Freud, he entered what he described as a confrontation with the unconscious that lasted 3 years. His professional life took a back seat. His social connections diminished. He withdrew into himself, not by choice, but by psychological necessity. Rather than resist this process, Jung made a crucial decision. He would go through it consciously. He began documenting everything in what would later become the famous Red Book. He learned to dialogue with the figures that emerged from his unconscious. He built stone towers with his hands, engaged in active imagination, and allowed himself to be completely undone by the process. Jung later reflected that everything meaningful in his life derived from this period of withdrawal. It wasn't time wasted or years lost to mental illness. It was the foundation upon which his entire life's work would be built. The theories that would transform psychology, the insights that would help millions of people understand themselves more deeply, all emerged from his willingness to let go of the world and descend into his own depths. This is what's happening to spiritually awakened people today. They are not failing at life. They're succeeding at a deeper level of existence that our culture doesn't recognize or value. They're undergoing what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who they truly are rather than who they think they should be. The withdrawal serves multiple psychological functions. First, it creates space for integration. The awakening experience often brings tremendous insight and expanded awareness, but this needs time to be properly integrated into one's life. Continuing with business as usual prevents this integration from occurring naturally. Second, it allows for shadow work to unfold. Jung emphasized that true spiritual development requires confronting the rejected, uncomfortable, unconscious parts of ourselves. This shadow material can't be integrated while maintaining the same external lifestyle and relationships that helped create the shadow in the first place. Third, it facilitates what Jung called the transcendent function, the emergence of something new from the tension between conscious and unconscious contents. This creative synthesis requires a withdrawal from external demands and expectations so that something genuinely original can emerge from within. The awakened person discovers that their previous motivations were largely ego-driven. The need for approval, success, security, recognition, all the things that fuel normal social behavior begin to feel foreign. It's not that they've become antisocial or lazy. They've simply outgrown the psychological structures that previously organized their life. This creates a profound sense of not belonging. They look around at a world obsessed with accumulation, achievement, and status, and they can't relate anymore. Conversations about career advancement feel meaningless. Discussions about material purchases seem trivial. The entire social fabric appears to be woven from concerns that no longer touch their soul. Jung understood this alienation as a natural consequence of consciousness evolution. When someone moves beyond identification with their ego, they naturally become less compatible with a culture built on ego gratification. They're not rejecting the world from superiority or judgment. They're simply operating from a different level of being. This incompatibility creates what Jung observed as a profound existential crisis. The awakened individual finds themselves caught between two worlds, unable to fully participate in either. They can't return to their previous unconscious state of being, but they haven't yet learned how to live consciously in a world that operates from unconsciousness. Jung witnessed this struggle in countless patients who described feeling like aliens in their own lives. A woman would tell him about sitting in board meetings listening to colleagues discuss quarterly profits with intense passion, while she felt like she was watching a play performed by actors who'd forgotten they were acting. A man would describe attending social gatherings where everyone seemed deeply invested in conversations about topics that felt completely hollow to him. This isn't intellectual arrogance or spiritual superiority. It's genuine incompatibility at the level of being. When your consciousness has expanded beyond identification with ego concerns, participating in ego-driven activities becomes psychologically painful. It's like trying to squeeze back into clothes you've outgrown. The fit is uncomfortable, restrictive, and ultimately impossible to maintain. Jung called this the burden of consciousness. The more aware you become of the unconscious patterns driving human behavior, the harder it becomes to participate in those patterns unconsciously. You see the projections, the shadow material, the collective delusions that keep society functioning, and you can't pretend you don't see them anymore. The awakened person begins to recognize that most social interactions are elaborate performances. People aren't really communicating from their authentic selves. They're playing roles, maintaining personas, avoiding uncomfortable truths about themselves and their relationships. Once you see this clearly, engaging in these performances feels like betraying your own soul. This recognition creates what Jung described as a deep loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of being conscious among the unconscious. You're surrounded by people, but nobody seems to be really there. Everyone's operating from their personas, their conditioned responses, their unconscious patterns. The authentic person you're looking for seems to be hiding behind layers of social programming. Jung experienced this profoundly during his own transformation. He found that many of his professional relationships became strained as he moved deeper into his exploration of the unconscious. Colleagues who once respected his work began to question his sanity. Social circles that once welcomed him started to feel uncomfortable with his evolving perspectives. He was changing in ways that made him less compatible with his previous world. But Jung discovered something remarkable through this process. As he let go of his attachment to external validation and social belonging, he began to access something far more valuable. He found what he called the self, the deeper organizing principle of his psyche that existed beyond ego identification. This self had its own wisdom, its own direction, its own sense of purpose that didn't depend on external circumstances. The self operates according to different principles than the ego. Where the ego seeks security, the self seeks growth. Where the ego wants comfort, the self demands authenticity. Where the ego tries to fit in, the self insists on standing out as who you truly are. This creates an internal conflict that can only be resolved by choosing which master to serve. Most people never face this choice consciously. They live their entire lives identified with their ego, following its demands for safety, approval, and material success. But the spiritually awakened person can no longer avoid this fundamental decision. They must choose between ego satisfaction and soul fulfillment, between social acceptance and authentic expression, between external success and inner development. Jung observed that those who choose the path of authenticity often go through what appears to be a professional and social decline. The driven executive becomes less interested in climbing the corporate ladder. The social butterfly finds large gatherings draining rather than energizing. The material accumulator loses interest in acquiring more possessions. From the outside, this looks like failure or depression. From the inside, it feels like coming home to yourself. This process isn't comfortable or easy. Jung described it as a kind of voluntary crucifixion of the ego. Everything that once defined you, everything that once seemed important, must be surrendered to make space for what you're becoming. It's like dying while still alive, releasing your grip on the identity you've spent decades building. The withdrawal from worldly concerns serves another crucial function that Jung recognized. It creates the psychological space necessary for what he called the transcendent function to operate. This is the psyche's natural ability to synthesize opposites and create something new from apparent contradictions. But this synthesis can't happen while you're caught up in the constant demands of external life. During periods of withdrawal, the awakened person often experiences what Jung called active imagination. Images, insights, and intuitions begin to emerge from the unconscious with unusual clarity and frequency. Dreams become more vivid and meaningful. Synchronicities multiply. Creative impulses arise that seem to come from somewhere beyond ordinary consciousness. This is the psyche's way of communicating its deeper wisdom when the ego finally stops talking long enough to listen. Jung found that his most profound insights came during these periods of withdrawal from professional and social obligations. When he stopped trying to be the successful psychiatrist everyone expected him to be, he became the pioneering explorer of human consciousness that the world actually needed. His withdrawal wasn't an escape from his purpose. It was the necessary condition for discovering what that purpose truly was. This pattern repeats itself in the lives of awakening individuals everywhere. The artist who stops creating commercially viable work and begins expressing their authentic vision. The teacher who leaves the institutional system to share wisdom in their own unique way. The healer who abandons conventional practice to develop their intuitive gifts. From society's perspective, these people are throwing away their potential. From the soul's perspective, they're finally claiming it. Jung emphasized that this withdrawal phase isn't permanent, but it is necessary. Like a seed that must be buried in darkness before it can sprout, the awakening consciousness must go through a period of apparent death before its true nature can emerge. The length of this phase varies for each individual, but Jung observed that fighting it only prolongs the process. Those who surrender to it consciously tend to move through it more quickly and completely. The key insight Jung offered is that this withdrawal isn't pathological. It's archetypal. Throughout human history, individuals undergoing profound spiritual transformation have needed to step away from conventional society temporarily. The hermit, the mystic, the shaman all follow this same pattern of withdrawal, transformation, and eventual return with gifts for their community. The modern world has created a particular challenge for these awakening souls that Jung couldn't have fully anticipated. We live in an era of unprecedented connectivity and stimulation. Social media bombards us with constant updates about other people's lives. News cycles demand our emotional investment in events we can't control. Consumer culture insists that happiness comes through acquisition and achievement. For the spiritually awakened, this environment becomes increasingly toxic. Jung observed that consciousness is like a sensitive instrument. The more refined it becomes, the more it can detect subtle energies and influences that others might not notice. What most people experience as normal social interaction, the awakened person experiences as psychic assault, the constant projection of unconscious material, the emotional manipulation of advertising, the collective anxiety transmitted through media consumption. All of this becomes overwhelming for someone whose consciousness has expanded beyond normal parameters. This hypersensitivity isn't weakness or mental illness. It's the natural result of consciousness development. Just as your eyes become more sensitive to light as they adjust to darkness, your psyche becomes more sensitive to unconscious influences as it becomes more conscious. The awakened person starts to feel physically ill in environments that are psychologically toxic, even if others seem perfectly comfortable there. Jung documented this phenomenon in his clinical work. Patients who had undergone profound spiritual experiences would report feeling nauseous in shopping malls, exhausted after social gatherings, and emotionally drained by television or social media. They weren't being dramatic or antisocial. Their consciousness had literally become incompatible with certain frequencies of human interaction. This creates what Jung called the hermit phase of individuation. Not because the person chooses isolation, but because isolation chooses them. Their psyche begins to reject environments and relationships that don't support their evolving consciousness. It's like developing an allergy to inauthenticity. What once felt normal now feels poisonous. The awakened individual discovers that they can no longer tolerate small talk the way they used to. Conversations about weather, sports, or celebrity gossip feel like psychological sandpaper. Not because these topics are inherently wrong, but because engaging with them requires suppressing the deeper awareness that's trying to emerge. It's like being asked to pretend you can't see color when you've just discovered the full spectrum of light. Jung experienced this personally during his confrontation with the unconscious. He found that maintaining his professional persona became increasingly difficult. Sitting in psychiatric conferences discussing patients in clinical terms felt like betraying the profound human reality he was discovering through his inner work. The more conscious he became, the less he could participate in the collective unconsciousness of his professional field. This incompatibility extends beyond social situations into the realm of work and career. The awakened person often finds that jobs they once performed competently now feel soul-crushing. Not because the work itself has changed, but because they can no longer ignore the spiritual and psychological cost of participating in systems built on unconscious principles. A corporate lawyer might suddenly see how their daily work contributes to a system of exploitation and manipulation. A marketing executive might recognize how they're being paid to manipulate people's unconscious desires for profit. A teacher might realize how the educational system suppresses rather than develops human consciousness. These aren't intellectual revelations, but visceral recognitions that make continued participation feel like self-betrayal. Jung called this the collision between individual consciousness and collective unconsciousness. When someone becomes genuinely conscious, they can no longer participate unconsciously in collective delusions. Every interaction becomes a choice between authenticity and conformity, between truth and social acceptance, between soul integrity and external approval. The awakened person begins to see through what Jung called the collective persona, the mask that society wears to hide its shadow. They recognize that much of what passes for civilization is actually organized unconsciousness, political systems built on projection and scapegoating, economic structures designed to exploit unconscious desires, social hierarchies maintained through collective denial of shadow material. This recognition creates what Jung described as a profound moral crisis. How do you live ethically in a world built on unconscious principles? How do you participate in society when you can see the unconscious patterns driving most human behavior? How do you maintain relationships with people who are still identified with personas and projections? Jung discovered that most awakened individuals go through a period of what he called moral inflation, where they judge others for their unconsciousness. This is a necessary but temporary phase. The awakened person feels angry at the collective delusions, frustrated with people who can't or won't see what seems obvious to them. They might become preachy, trying to wake others up, or cynical, dismissing everyone as hopelessly unconscious. But Jung observed that this judgmental phase eventually gives way to something deeper: compassion. The awakened person realizes that they too were once unconscious, that awakening is a gradual process and that judging others for being where you once were is itself a form of unconsciousness. This shift from judgment to compassion marks a crucial development in the individuation process. However, compassion doesn't eliminate the incompatibility. Understanding why people behave unconsciously doesn't make unconscious behavior any rate. The easier-to-toll awakened person might feel love for humanity while simultaneously being unable to participate in human society as it currently exists. They become like visitors from another dimension, able to observe and understand but unable to fully engage. This creates what Jung recognized as the fundamental dilemma of consciousness. The more aware you become, the more isolated you become from the collective. But this isolation isn't punishment for awakening. It's the necessary condition for developing something that the collective desperately needs, but doesn't yet know how to receive. Jung understood that consciousness development follows a predictable pattern. First comes the breakdown of ego identification, then the encounter with shadow material, next the recognition of collective unconsciousness, then the period of withdrawal and integration. Finally, the emergence of what Jung called the individuated self, a consciousness that can engage with the world without being absorbed by it. During the withdrawal phase, something remarkable happens that Jung documented extensively. The person begins to access what he called the objective psyche, layers of consciousness that exist beyond personal ego. They might experience visions, receive intuitive guidance, or develop abilities that seem to transcend normal human limitations. This isn't delusion or mental illness. It's the natural result of consciousness expansion. Jung emphasized that these expanded states aren't the goal of spiritual development, but rather tools for service. The awakened person isn't meant to remain in blissful states of higher consciousness. They're meant to integrate these experiences and find ways to serve the collective evolution of human awareness. But this service can't be forced or rushed. It must emerge naturally from the completion of the withdrawal phase. The timing of this emergence can't be predicted or controlled. Some individuals remain in withdrawal for months, others for years. Jung observed that attempting to force premature re-engagement usually results in regression to earlier stages of development. The psyche has its own wisdom about when someone is ready to return to the world, and this wisdom must be trusted even when it contradicts social expectations. During this waiting period, the awakened person often experiences what Jung called the dark night of the soul. Everything that once gave life meaning has been stripped away, but nothing new has yet emerged to replace it. They exist in a kind of psychological limbo, neither fully human nor fully divine, unable to go back but not yet able to move forward. Jung insisted that this phase serves an essential function. It's during these periods of apparent emptiness that the deepest transformation occurs. The old self must be completely dissolved before the new self can be born. Trying to skip this dissolution or hurry through it only prolongs the overall process. The caterpillar must become soup before it can become a butterfly. The awakened person learns to find meaning in meaninglessness, purpose in purposelessness, direction in directionlessness. They discover what Jung called the wisdom of uncertainty, The recognition that not knowing can be more authentic than false certainty. This isn't nihilism, but rather a profound trust in the intelligence of the transformative process itself. Jung observed that those who successfully navigate this phase develop what he called psychological resilience. They become comfortable with paradox, able to hold opposing truths simultaneously without needing resolution. They learn to act decisively while remaining open to being completely wrong. They develop the capacity to care deeply while staying unattached to outcomes. This psychological flexibility becomes crucial for the eventual return to world engagement. The awakened person must learn to interface with unconscious systems while maintaining their consciousness. They must find ways to serve collective evolution without being pulled back into collective unconsciousness. They must discover how to be fully human while never forgetting their expanded nature. Jung recognized that this balancing act requires tremendous skill and ongoing vigilance. It's not enough to have awakening experiences or even to complete the withdrawal phase successfully. The real test comes in learning to live consciously in an unconscious world, to maintain inner truth while engaging outer reality, to serve without sacrificing, to love without losing oneself. The spiritually awakened aren't letting go of the world because they've given up on it. They're letting go of their unconscious relationship with the world so they can eventually engage with it more consciously. Their withdrawal isn't permanent retreat but temporary preparation for a more authentic and effective form of service. So what does this mean for you if you're experiencing this withdrawal? This strange disconnection from everything that once mattered? Jung would tell you that you're not broken, you're not failing, you're not depressed or mentally ill. You're evolving. Your consciousness is outgrowing the containers that once held your life together, and this process, though painful, is absolutely necessary. The spiritually awake aren't abandoning the world out of selfishness or escapism. They're undergoing the most profound transformation a human being can experience. They're dying to who they thought they were so they can be reborn as who they truly are. And this death, this letting go, this quiet withdrawal from everything familiar, is the price of authentic existence. Jung's warning wasn't meant to discourage spiritual seeking. It was meant to prepare us for what genuine awakening actually looks like. Not the blissful enlightenment promised by spiritual marketers, but the messy, uncomfortable, lonely process of becoming real in a world that runs on illusion. If you're walking this path, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, know that you're following the footsteps of every conscious being who ever lived. The mystics, the sages, the artists, the healers, they all went through this same process of letting go. And like them, you'll eventually emerge with gifts the world desperately needs, even if it doesn't know it yet. Your withdrawal isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your real one. Trust the process, honor the dissolution. And remember, consciousness itself is guiding this transformation, even when you can't see where it's leading. The world needs awakened souls more than it needs productive citizens. Your job isn't to fit back into the old containers. Your job is to become so authentically yourself that you create new possibilities for human existence.